Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another video. Today we're going to be talking about turning an idea into a book. So what do you do when you have an idea? How do you turn that into like a book that exists? Basically, how do you develop an idea? This could be interpreted as like a very long process. You know, like are we talking like idea to final draft? I'm going to be focusing on basically taking that initial seed of an idea and turning it into something workable and actually developing it. I'm not gonna walk through like and then the first draft and then the editing and everything. This has been such a requested topic, and the only reason I haven't made the video is honestly due to my own poor time management skills, fully to fault of my own. Now I do want to be clear, there's no one way to develop a book. There's no distinct process step by step by step by step. You can develop your book in any order you want, and you're gonna find that it's gonna be kind of impossible to develop it in the same order every time, because every idea is gonna naturally be a little different. Every idea will have different starting points and lead to branch off to different things. I very commonly get asked, what should I develop first, the characters or the plot? You're gonna find it almost impossible to just sit down and only develop the characters and then do all the plot, or only develop the plot and then all the characters. Everything's gonna happen bit by bit, piece by piece. When it happens, you're just gonna have realizations and insights about the story, and you can't control them, but that's okay. They're gonna happen the order they happen. Roll with that. I'm gonna talk about some different things you can do. This doesn't need to happen in order. The first thing that I would recommend doing would be to write literally everything down. There's something very powerful about the physical process of taking notes. So when you first get an idea, I think the most helpful thing to do, open up a document, or if you write by hand, you know, get out a notebook and start writing down everything, anything that comes to mind. I like to name my characters very, very early on because I struggle to conceptualize them as people until they have names. So that's something that I do right away, but just literally write down everything. A lot of it will later on have no bearing on your story, and that's totally okay. Just get it all down. I think that's a great first step. One question that I find really useful to ask myself early on is, whose story is it? You may find that it's a lot of people's story and you want to write your book from multiple points of view. Personally, I shy away from multi-point of view novels because to me they just aren't my cup of tea as a writer. Nothing against them as a reader, just as a writer, not my favorite thing. I like to have a more intimate scope. So I'm usually asking myself, who's gonna be my main character? However, that said, one of the first questions I usually end up asking myself is, whose story is it? I had a professor who would always ask this about the story, and sometimes would have stories in workshop and she'd be like, I don't think it's the main character's story. Like, I think it's actually someone else's story. She'd be like, I think it's actually the husband's story. I think it's actually the sister's story. Like, this is the main character that you chose, but are they actually the main character? So I always try to start by asking myself, who is going to be my narrator? Whose lens into the story are we going to get? So I'm going to use my novel Honey Vinegar as an example of this, because this book could have gone many different ways if I had chosen other protagonists. And a lot of the time, there are a lot of possible stories that you can explore here with the same concept. You just have to pick the one you want to tell. So I had this initial setup of a girl gets struck by lightning, right? And then I had some characters around the girl. I had her half-sister, I had her mother, I had her, oh, what would they be to each other? I don't know what Teresa's relationship to Freya would be. The sister's aunt. And then there's also a boy who witnesses her get struck by lightning. To be honest, when I first conceptualized the book, I was going to write it in third person with multiple points of view. I was gonna have Freya's point of view, who is the girl who gets struck by lightning. I was gonna have Sybil's point of view, who is my now narrator, Freya's sister. I was going to have Sybil's aunt, Teresa. I was going to have their mother, Aline, and I was gonna have some point of views from Whisper, this boy who witnesses the lightning strike. And then I realized, actually, I think the person whose story it is Sybil, the sister of the girl who gets struck by lightning. With that concept of a girl who gets struck by lightning, the natural impulse is to make the one who is struck by lightning the main character. Naturally, you would think it's her story, right? I felt that there was a more interesting way to access this narrative from another point of view, and I thought that that was actually the more interesting story because it was a bit less expected, and the development that she was gonna go through was just more compelling. I'm glad I took the time to ask myself, like, whose story is this? Because we could have ended up with a very different book had I gone the initial obvious route and made Freya the main character. Still could have been a book, would have been a very different book. So I think that's always a great place to start, is identifying whose story it is that you want to tell. Sometimes there are multiple characters with interesting stories. You just have to pick the one whose narrative you want to tell. Very early on, I like to ask myself, how do I want to tell this story in terms of form? Now, I focus on this really early in the process because I'm a big form nerd. A lot of people probably form is an afterthought to storyline or plot. For me, form is like the bread and butter. Like I need the form from the beginning. So I usually identify the form very early. And so by the form, I mean how I'm going to tell the story in terms of point of view and tense and narrative device, even style of scenes, style of chapters, and honestly even like aesthetic style. This is all very important for me as someone who's a very form-based writer. Other people are not so form-based as me, and it's not because it's the better way to write, it's just how my brain works, to be honest. Logically, I don't even think it makes the most sense to write this way. It's just literally my brain is like, forms. But it's something I like to ask myself early on. It does impact how the story is going to evolve. The way I'm going to write the story on the page is related to how I feel and interpret the story in my brain. So I need to know these things early on. Like, I need to know, am I hearing a first person voice or a third person voice or a second person voice, and what tense is it in? This is an issue I had with Holding a Ghost, the novel I'm currently writing. It's in a weird point of view, but it is in present tense. But originally I was actually writing it in past tense, and I knew something was wrong. There was a disconnect there because when I would hear passages and lines in my head, they were always in present tense. And then I was trying to write it in past tense. I wasn't listening to my intuition, how I felt and saw and experienced the story in my mind. It was creating issues for me, and I wish I had just listened to that voice and the writing became much easier. So that's why I need to know form like right away, because it's like downloading a file and not knowing like what file format it is. Maybe you don't have the right program to open it, right? So that's kind of why I need to know the form, because that's how I'm gonna see the story. I do, in somewhat concrete and kind of an abstract way, see and feel my stories in my mind the same way that they are written, kind of. Yes and no. Either I see and hear them the way that they are in my mind, or I see and hear them in a way that translates to how they're written, if that makes sense. This might be something you come back to quite a bit later if you don't care about it like me. Another really good place to start is just knowing what core scenes you imagine. I am a discovery writer, so I don't plan out my whole book, but usually there are kind of like core scenes that, you know, it's like, buy this concept, get these 6 scenes for free. The rest you have to work for, the rest will come later, but usually there are a couple scenes that feel inherently connected to the concept. I pick up the concept off the shelf and these scenes all start rolling around on the floor. Those scenes are so important. If you find your ideas tend to come with these core scenes, that's like your base blueprint, right? Some of them might end up not being relevant. You're gonna think of a lot of things in the brainstorming phase that gets chucked later. And that is okay. That's the nature of brainstorming. Not all of it's going to be useful to you. But those core scenes, either for now or entirely, are like the base building blocks, and they can give you really important insights into the trajectory of your plot. I get a lot of questions from people who are like, I have this concept, I don't know how to develop the plot. I relate to this struggle also because I'm terrible at developing plot too, so same. But one thing I've found helped is someone who that's not a natural thing for me. Plot is like the least natural aspect of storytelling for me, like it's what doesn't come naturally to me. That's why I need to discover, right? Because it only becomes natural when I actually start writing. But I do find that you can learn a lot about the story from those scenes. A lot of developing an idea is getting pieces that I actually don't know what they mean yet, and then having to figure out what they mean. So I'm being given these scenes, I don't know what these scenes mean, but I can figure out what they mean in relation to the story by looking at them carefully, you know? If I see a scene of something happening, well, that tells me a lot of things. That tells me that the story is gonna go a way that's gonna allow for this thing to happen and for it to be important. Literally just blocking out any aspect of the story that you know. Like, these are my characters, blocking out who your main characters are gonna be. This setting, figuring out where the setting is gonna be. Like, just asking yourself these basic core questions, using those as launching points. Some people tend to start with a big global idea and then they get little ideas from there, which is what you'd think would be normal. Other people, like myself, tend to get little ideas and then we have to figure out how those fit together into the big global idea. So other people will be like, this is where my book is set, and then they'll start getting individual world building details based on that setting. Whereas people like me will get random little world building ideas and then the setting. Some people work inwards and some people work outwards. I very much work inwards. So that's why for me, a lot of the time my notes start with very specific things like random little details, lines of dialogue, images, like random stuff. And then I'm like, okay, what is this pointing to? So based on these images, this is probably my setting. Stuff like that. Some people might find that they want to start from the general point. They want to be like, this is where I want my story to be set, and then you'll get individual ideas from there. A lot of the time it'll be a mixture of the two. It's certainly not one or the other. There's no wrong way to do it, but I do think it helps to know, like, ask yourself, like, how do I normally think of ideas? What's my normal thought process? When you can think about your own patterns of thinking, it'll help you know what to expect and build a brainstorming process that builds off of your natural way of brainstorming and writing. There's a term I really like that a fiction professor of mine used to talk about that she called oxygen moments. She actually meant it in a different way, but when people would ask, how do you get ideas? She would say, think of the oxygen moments of your life. They're the moments that when you think of them, you hold a bit of oxygen in your chest because they, and this is her phrasing and I love it, they shimmer with importance. She was like, find the moments of your life that are shimmery with importance. Those are the things that are worth writing about. Now me, as someone who doesn't write about my own life at all, in fact, I actively avoid it, I think that this applies similarly to ideas themselves. Like, there are going to be pieces of a story that shimmer with importance and you know that they're important. I'd say listen to that instinct. Even as a discovery writer, so someone who doesn't plan out my plots in advance, if I have these few scenes, it can help to just like put them in what I think the order is. That can kind of give me an idea of what the overarching plot will be, even if I'm going to then work to discover the book as I write it. One thing that I think can help develop an idea, maybe more than anything else, is figuring out your core character relationship. As you start to sketch out your characters, figuring out the relationships between them will really translate to a lot of plot development. Sometimes a single character on their own isn't going to give you a lot of plot, but a character and another character and their relationship will give you a lot of plot. That'll give you interpersonal conflict, relationship development, and then also personal development for each of the individual characters. So I always like to try and identify what I think the core relationships I'm exploring in the story are. Usually novels will have many relationships. Obviously, every time you have two or more characters, they have a relationship. But usually a novel will have like one or two main relationships that's primarily being explored, and identifying those core relationships can be super helpful. Now, when you have a lot of material to work with, you have some events, some characters. One thing that I think a lot of us are gonna deal with, at least I do, you have this initial rush of brainstorming and then it kind of halts. It kind of just skids to a stop. Now, other people probably don't struggle with this as much as I do. There are some people who naturally produce content a lot quicker than I do. I produce like plot content extremely slowly when I'm not actively working on a book. This is why when I used to be an outliner, it would literally take me years to outline a book because I don't develop plots quickly. It just takes me a really long time, and some people have the gift where they can develop a whole book and its whole plot in a couple weeks. I don't have that gift. In becoming a discovery writer, I also learned something about myself, which was if I'm actively working on a project, I will actively get ideas. Brainstorming will sometimes stop if I'm not actively working on it. If you get stuck, I think setting aside time to actively brainstorm can be super beneficial. And you don't need to know what you're doing. Or like, okay, today I'm gonna do some brainstorming work. You don't need to know where you're going with it, what you're doing with it. Open up your notes document, write down anything that comes to mind, start fleshing things out. Like, it can be really, you can start really simple, like, okay, I have a character, let's do some loose character profiles. Like, just write down information I already know, their age, brief physical description. And the more you actively work on it, you'll find that you start naturally developing ideas, and you can make a good amount of progress. At least I find I can make a good amount of progress developing a book if I'm actively in the document writing things down. And sometimes I start with really basic things, and the more you work on it, kind of just like warms up the idea and it'll start working. One technique I find really helpful for myself is to identify the questions that I have. Sometimes you have this big amorphous blob of plot and idea and character. There are certain things that you just don't have figured out. And so I often write down in my notes document, like I have a tangible section called questions I have for myself, where I just write down like things I don't understand yet about the story. For example, like, what is this character's backstory? Or what does this character want? Or how does this work in this world, you know? They can be questions about anything, but identifying the questions you have for yourself and then actively working to answer them can also be super helpful in developing that idea. For one of my final tips, I really just want to emphasize that sometimes you have to give it time, and that's okay. Ideas can take patience. Some people can do a whole book development in just a couple weeks. Good for them. If that's you, good for you. You're blessed with this gift. For a lot of people, it's just not that quick, and that's okay. It's natural to feel a bit of impatience if you get an idea and you want it to progress, but it's okay to just give it time. Sometimes the idea just needs to slow cook for a little while longer. I have had ideas that it has taken me years before I got around to writing them, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes that time fermenting will do the idea a lot of good. So if you feel like you're not making progress, there's no rush. Unless you literally have a deadline or something, in which case just start writing it. That's the quickest way to brainstorm, is to just start writing anyways. If you're not on deadline, there's literally no rush. The idea will always be there for you, and it's okay to know to give it time. If you have an idea that's 2 months old and you're worried that you don't have everything figured out, that's totally normal. Just give it more time. And my final tip is know that it's okay to roll with the changes. Things are gonna change, and your intention might change, and something might come up that completely changes what your initial intention was, and that's not a bad thing. The goal of writing a novel is not to produce something that is as close to your initial intention as possible. A lot of the time, the more you develop a book, you'll explore your intention, you'll find a new intention, and that's totally okay. There's a quote that I want to read to you. It's gonna get me demonetized, and it's from Gerald Stem, and it's, if you start out to write a poem about 2 dogs fucking, and you write a poem about 2 dogs fucking, then you wrote a poem about 2 dogs fucking. Probably the most interesting version of the story is actually not what you were initially planning. I kind of believe that it's actually rare that our conscious brain is the smartest part of us. Usually it's the unconscious part of us. It's whatever emerges through the story that you then lift up that's often the most interesting. It's actually rare that your initial plan is the best thing. And so I think it's okay to embrace the flexibility of an idea. Let it evolve. If it wants to evolve, let it evolve. You don't have to try and wrangle it back and be like, no, stay here. Let it evolve, see where it takes you. Sometimes it can be scary. I had an idea for a project I'm planning the other day that really changes things, and I'm struggling to commit to it because I don't know what I want, but the more I sit with it, the more I think it's the right decision. And I think you'll find that when you're at these crossroads where you could do A or B, giving it a bit of time will often make it clear which is the right path for you. So it's okay for things to change. In fact, I would embrace the fact that your ideas will change. I've never written anything that's really that close to my initial intention, and if anything, it's kind of fun to compare and like look back and be like, what was I originally planning for this book? Wow, it's so different. But I'm never disappointed that it didn't end up there. It's just part of the idea's natural growth. So that's some things to say on developing an idea. I know this wasn't the most concrete video, but also it's not the most concrete process. It's pretty fluffy. Like, this is gonna just happen how it happens, you know? But those are some things that I find helpful. So I hope that it helps if you're stuck at that idea phase. I will also redirect you if you want more on this. Like last year, I did a really detailed series on this on the Reezy channel called How to Develop a Book. It's like a 5-part series with like templates and exercises and everything. So if you want a more guided walkthrough on this process, I will leave a link to that as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video.